Part Two, Chapter 5, Section 2 of The Possessed by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 5, On the Eve of the Fête, Section 2. 2 days after the incident I have described, I met her in a numerous company, who were driving out on some expedition in 3 coaches, surrounded by others on horseback. She beckoned to me, stopped her carriage, and pressingly urged me to join their party. A place was found for me in the carriage, and she laughingly introduced me to her companions, gorgeously attired ladies, and explained to me that they were all going on a very interesting expedition. She was laughing, and seemed somewhat excessively happy. Just lately she had been very lively, even playful, in fact. The expedition was certainly an eccentric one. They were all going to a house the other side of the river, to the merchant Sevastyanov's. In the lodge of this merchant's house our saint and prophet, Semyon Yakovlevitch, who was famous not only amongst us, but in the surrounding provinces, and even in Petersburg and Moscow, had been living for the last 10 years in retirement, ease, and comfort. Every one went to see him, especially visitors to the neighbourhood, extracting from him some crazy utterance, bowing down to him and leaving an offering. These offerings were sometimes considerable, and if Semyon Yakovlevitch did not himself assign them to some other purpose, were piously sent to some church, or more often to the monastery of Our Lady. A monk from the monastery was always in waiting upon Semyon Yakovlevitch with this object. All were in expectation of great amusement. No one of the party had seen Semyon Yakovlevitch before, except Lyamshin, who declared that the saint had given orders that he should be driven out with a broom, and had with his own hand flung 2 big baked potatoes after him. Among the party I noticed Pyotr Stepanovitch, again riding a hired Cossack horse, on which he sat extremely badly, and Nikolay Vsyevolodovitch also on horseback. The latter did not always hold aloof from social diversions, and on such occasions always wore an air of gaiety, although, as always, he spoke little and seldom. When our party had crossed the bridge and reached the hotel of the town, some one suddenly announced that in one of the rooms of the hotel they had just found a traveller who had shot himself, and were expecting the police. At once the suggestion was made that they should go and look at the suicide. The idea met with approval; our ladies had never seen a suicide. I remember one of them said aloud on the occasion, "Everything's so boring; one can't be squeamish over one's amusements as long as they're interesting." Only a few of them remained outside; the others went in a body into the dirty corridor, and amongst the others I saw to my amazement Lizaveta Nikolaevna. The door of the room was open, and they did not, of course, dare to prevent our going in to look at the suicide. He was quite a young lad, not more than 19. He must have been very good looking, with thick fair hair, with a regular oval face, and a fine pure forehead. The body was already stiff, and his white young face looked like marble. On the table lay a note in his handwriting to the effect that no one was to blame for his death, that he had killed himself because he had squandered 400 roubles. The word "squandered" was used in the letter. In the 4 lines of his letter there were 3 mistakes in spelling. A stout country gentleman, evidently a neighbour, who had been staying in the hotel on some business of his own, was particularly distressed about it. From his words it appeared that the boy had been sent by his family, that is, a widowed mother, sisters, and aunts, from the country to the town in order that, under the supervision of a female relation in the town, he might purchase and take home with him various articles for the trousseau of his eldest sister, who was going to be married. The family had, with sighs of apprehension, entrusted him with the 400 roubles, the savings of 10 years, and had sent him on his way with exhortations, prayers, and signs of the cross. The boy had till then been well behaved and trustworthy. Arriving 3 days before at the town, he had not gone to his relations, had put up at the hotel, and gone straight to the club in the hope of finding in some back room a travelling banker, or at least some game of cards for money. But that evening there was no banker there, or gambling going on. Going back to the hotel about midnight, he asked for champagne, Havana cigars, and ordered a supper of 6 or 7 dishes. But the champagne made him drunk and the cigar made him sick, so that he did not touch the food when it was brought to him, and went to bed almost unconscious. Waking next morning as fresh as an apple, he went at once to the gypsies' camp, which was in a suburb beyond the river, and of which he had heard the day before at the club. He did not reappear at the hotel for 2 days. At last, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the previous day, he had returned drunk, had at once gone to bed, and had slept till 10 o'clock in the evening. On waking up he had asked for a cutlet, a bottle of Chateau d'Yquem, and some grapes, paper, and ink, and his bill. No one noticed anything special about him; he was quiet, gentle, and friendly. He must have shot himself at about midnight, though it was strange that no one had heard the shot, and they only raised the alarm at midday, when, after knocking in vain, they had broken in the door. The bottle of Chateau d'Yquem was half empty; there was half a plateful of grapes left too. The shot had been fired from a little 3-chambered revolver straight into the heart. Very little blood had flowed. The revolver had dropped from his hand on to the carpet. The boy himself was half lying in a corner of the sofa. Death must have been instantaneous. There was no trace of the anguish of death in the face; the expression was serene, almost happy, as though there were no cares in his life. All our party stared at him with greedy curiosity. In every misfortune of one's neighbour there is always something cheering for an onlooker, whoever he may be. Our ladies gazed in silence; their companions distinguished themselves by their wit and their superb equanimity. One observed that his was the best way out of it, and that the boy could not have hit upon anything more sensible. Another observed that he had had a good time if only for a moment. A third suddenly blurted out the inquiry why people had begun hanging and shooting themselves among us of late, as though they had suddenly lost their roots, as though the ground were giving way under every one's feet. People looked coldly at this raisonneur. Then Lyamshin, who prided himself on playing the fool, took a bunch of grapes from the plate; another, laughing, followed his example, and a third stretched out his hand for the Chateau d'Yquem. But the head of police arriving checked him, and even ordered that the room should be cleared. As every one had seen all they wanted, they went out without disputing, although Lyamshin began pestering the police captain about something. The general merry making, laughter, and playful talk were twice as lively on the latter half of the way. We arrived at Semyon Yakovlevitch's just at 1 o'clock. The gate of the rather large house stood unfastened, and the approach to the lodge was open. We learnt at once that Semyon Yakovlevitch was dining, but was receiving guests. The whole crowd of us went in. The room in which the saint dined and received visitors had 3 windows and was fairly large. It was divided into 2 equal parts by a wooden lattice work partition which ran from wall to wall and was 3 or 4 feet high. Ordinary visitors remained on the outside of this partition, but lucky ones were, by the saint's invitation, admitted through the partition doors into his half of the room, and if so disposed he made them sit down on the sofa or on his old leather chairs. He himself invariably sat in an old‐fashioned shabby Voltaire arm‐chair. He was a rather big, bloated‐looking, yellow‐faced man of 55, with a bald head and scanty flaxen hair. He wore no beard, his right cheek was swollen, and his mouth seemed somehow twisted awry. He had a large wart on the left side of his nose, narrow eyes, and a calm, stolid, sleepy expression. He was dressed in European style, in a black coat, but had no waistcoat or tie. A rather coarse but white shirt peeped out below his coat. There was something the matter with his feet, I believe, and he kept them in slippers. I've heard that he had at one time been a clerk and received a rank in the service. He had just finished some fish soup and was beginning his second dish of potatoes in their skins, eaten with salt. He never ate anything else, but he drank a great deal of tea, of which he was very fond. 3 servants provided by the merchant were running to and fro about him. One of them was in a swallow tail, the second looked like a workman, and the third like a verger. There was also a very lively boy of 16. Besides the servants there was present, holding a jug, a reverend, grey‐headed monk who was a little too fat. On one of the tables a huge samovar was boiling, and a tray with almost 2 dozen glasses was standing near it. On another table, opposite, offerings had been placed: some loaves and also some pounds of sugar, 2 pounds of tea, a pair of embroidered slippers, a foulard handkerchief, a length of cloth, a piece of linen, and so on. Money offerings almost all went into the monk's jug. The room was full of people, at least a dozen visitors, of whom 2 were sitting with Semyon Yakovlevitch on the other side of the partition. One was a grey‐headed old pilgrim of the peasant class, and the other a little dried‐up monk, who sat demurely with his eyes cast down. The other visitors were all standing on the near side of the partition, and were mostly, too, of the peasant class, except one elderly and poverty‐stricken lady, one landowner, and a stout merchant, who had come from the district town, a man with a big beard dressed in the Russian style, though he was known to be worth 100,000. All were waiting for their chance, not daring to speak of themselves. 4 were on their knees, but the one who attracted most attention was the landowner, a stout man of 45, kneeling right at the partition, more conspicuous than any one, waiting reverently for a propitious word or look from Semyon Yakovlevitch. He had been there for about an hour already, but the saint still did not notice him. Our ladies crowded right up to the partition, whispering gaily and laughingly together. They pushed aside or got in front of all the other visitors, even those on their knees, except the landowner, who remained obstinately in his prominent position, even holding on to the partition. Merry and greedily inquisitive eyes were turned upon Semyon Yakovlevitch, as well as lorgnettes, pince nez, and even opera‐glasses. Lyamshin, at any rate, looked through an opera‐glass. Semyon Yakovlevitch calmly and lazily scanned all with his little eyes. Milovzors," he deigned to pronounce in a hoarse bass and slightly staccato. All our party laughed. "What's the meaning of milovzors?" But Semyon Yakovlevitch relapsed into silence and finished his potatoes. Presently he wiped his lips with his napkin and they handed him tea. As a rule he did not take tea alone, but poured out some for his visitors, but by no means for all, usually pointing himself to those he wished to honour, and his choice always surprised people by its unexpectedness. Passing by the wealthy and the high‐placed, he sometimes pitched upon a peasant or some decrepit old woman. Another time he would pass over the beggars to honour some fat wealthy merchant. Tea was served differently too, to different people. Sugar was put into some of the glasses and handed separately with others, while some got it without any sugar at all. This time the favoured one was the monk sitting by him who had sugar put in, and the old pilgrim to whom it was given without any sugar. The fat monk with the jug, from the monastery, for some reason had none handed to him at all, though up till then he had had his glass every day. "Semyon Yakovlevitch, do say something to me. I've been longing to make your acquaintance for ever so long," carolled the gorgeously dressed lady from our carriage, screwing up her eyes and smiling. She was the lady who had observed that one must not be squeamish about one's amusements, so long as they were interesting. Semyon Yakovlevitch did not even look at her. The kneeling landowner uttered a deep sonorous sigh, like the sound of a big pair of bellows. "With sugar in it," said Semyon Yakovlevitch suddenly, pointing to the wealthy merchant. The latter moved forward and stood beside the kneeling gentleman. "Some more sugar for him," ordered Semyon Yakovlevitch, after the glass had already been poured out. They put some more in. More for him." More was put in a third time, and again a fourth. The merchant began submissively drinking his syrup. "Heavens!" whispered the people, crossing themselves. The kneeling gentleman again heaved a deep, sonorous sigh. "Father! Semyon Yakovlevitch!" The voice of the poor lady rang out all at once plaintively, though so sharply that it was startling. Our party had shoved her back to the wall. "A whole hour, dear father, I've been waiting for grace. Speak to me. Consider my grace and my helplessness." "Ask her," said Semyon Yakovlevitch to the verger, who went to the partition. "Have you done what Semyon Yakovlevitch bade you last time?" he asked the widow in a soft and measured voice. Done it? Father Semyon Yakovlevitch, how can one do it with them?" wailed the widow. "They're cannibals. They are lodging a complaint against me... in the court. They threaten to take it to the Senate. That's how they treat their own mother." "Give her." Semyon Yakovlevitch pointed to a sugar loaf. The boy skipped up, seized the sugar loaf, and dragged it to the widow. "Ah, Father, great is your merciful kindness! What am I to do with so much?" wailed the widow. "More, more!" said Semyon Yakovlevitch lavishly. They dragged her another sugar loaf. "More, more!" the saint commanded. They took her a third, and finally a fourth. The widow was surrounded with sugar on all sides. The monk from the monastery sighed. All this might have gone to the monastery that day as it had done on former occasions. "What am I to do with so much?" the widow sighed obsequiously. "It's enough to make one person sick. Is it some sort of a prophecy, Father?" "Be sure it's by way of a prophecy," said someone in the crowd. "Another pound for her, another!" Semyon Yakovlevitch persisted. There was a whole sugar loaf still on the table, but the saint ordered a pound to be given, and they gave her a pound. "Lord have mercy on us!" gasped the people, crossing themselves. "It's surely a prophecy." "Sweeten your heart for the future with mercy and loving kindness, and then come to make complaints against your own children. Bone of your bone. That's what we must take this emblem to mean," the stout monk from the monastery, who had had no tea given to him, said softly but self‐complacently, taking upon himself the rôle of interpreter in an access of wounded vanity. "What are you saying, Father?" cried the widow, suddenly infuriated. "Why, they dragged me into the fire with a rope round me when the Verhishin's house was burnt, and they locked up a dead cat in my chest. They are ready to do any villainy." "Away with her, away with her!" Semyon Yakovlevitch said suddenly, waving his hands. The verger and the boy dashed through the partition. The verger took the widow by the arm, and without resisting she trailed to the door, keeping her eyes fixed on the loaves of sugar that had been bestowed on her, which the boy dragged after her. "One to be taken away. Take it away!" Semyon Yakovlevitch commanded to the servant like a workman, who remained with him. The latter rushed after the retreating woman, and the three servants returned somewhat later, bringing back one loaf of sugar which had been presented to the widow and now taken away from her. She carried off three, however. "Semyon Yakovlevitch," said a voice at the door, "I dreamt of a bird, a jackdaw. It flew out of the water and flew into the fire. What does the dream mean?" "Frost," Semyon Yakovlevitch pronounced. "Semyon Yakovlevitch, why don't you answer me all this time? I've been interested in you ever so long," the lady of our party began again. "Ask him," said Semyon Yakovlevitch, not heeding her, but pointing to the kneeling gentleman. The monk from the monastery, to whom the order was given, moved sedately to the kneeling figure. "How have you sinned? And was not some command laid upon you?" "Not to fight, not to give the rein to my hands," answered the kneeling gentleman hoarsely. "Have you obeyed?" asked the monk. "I cannot obey. My own strength gets the better of me." "Away with him! Away with him! With a broom! With a broom!" cried Semyon Yakovlevitch, waving his hands. The gentleman rushed out of the room without waiting for this penalty. "He's left a gold piece where he knelt," observed the monk, picking up a half imperial. "For him," said the saint, pointing to the rich merchant. The latter dared not refuse it, and took it. "Gold to gold," the monk from the monastery could not refrain from saying. "And give him some with sugar in it," said the saint, pointing to Mavriky Nikolaevitch. The servant poured out the tea, and took it by mistake to the dandy with the pince nez. "The long one," Semyon Yakovlevitch corrected him. Mavriky Nikolaevitch took the glass, made a military half bow, and began drinking it. I don't know why, but all our party burst into peals of laughter. "Mavriky Nikolaevitch," cried Liza, addressing him suddenly, "that kneeling gentleman has gone away. You kneel down in his place." Mavriky Nikolaevitch looked at her in amazement. "I beg you to. You'll do me the greatest favour. Listen, Mavriky Nikolaevitch," she went on, speaking in an emphatic, obstinate, excited, and rapid voice. "You must kneel down. I must see you kneel down. If you won't, don't come near me. I insist, I insist." I don't know what she meant by it, but she insisted upon it relentlessly, as though she were in a fit. Mavriky Nikolaevitch, as we shall see later, set down these capricious impulses, which had been particularly frequent of late, to outbreaks of blind hatred for him, not due to spite, for on the contrary she esteemed him, loved him, and respected him, and he knew that himself, but from a peculiar unconscious hatred which at times she could not control. In silence he gave his cup to an old woman standing behind him, opened the door of the partition, and, without being invited, stepped into Semyon Yakovlevitch's private apartment and knelt down in the middle of the room in sight of all. I imagine that he was deeply shocked in his candid and delicate heart by Liza's coarse and mocking freak before the whole company. Perhaps he imagined that she would feel ashamed of herself, seeing his humiliation, on which she had so insisted. Of course no one but he would have dreamt of bringing a woman to reason by so naive and risky a proceeding. He remained kneeling with his imperturbable gravity, long, tall, awkward, and ridiculous. But our party did not laugh. The unexpectedness of the action produced a painful shock. Every one looked at Liza. "Anoint, anoint," muttered Semyon Yakovlevitch. Liza suddenly turned white, cried out, and rushed through the partition. Then a rapid and hysterical scene followed. She began pulling Mavriky Nikolaevitch up with all her might, tugging at his elbows with both hands. Get up!" she screamed as though she were crazy. "Get up at once, at once! How dare you!" Mavriky Nikolaevitch got up from his knees. She clutched his arms above the elbow and looked intently into his face. There was terror in her expression. "Milosvors, milosvors!" Semyon Yakovlevitch repeated again. She dragged Mavriky Nikolaevitch back to the other part of the room at last. There was some commotion in all our company. The lady from our carriage, probably intending to relieve the situation, loudly and shrilly asked the saint for the third time with an affected smile: "Well, Semyon Yakovlevitch, won't you utter some saying for me? I've been reckoning so much on you." "Out with the... out with the..." said Semyon Yakovlevitch, suddenly addressing her with an extremely indecent word. The words were uttered savagely and with horrifying distinctness. Our ladies shrieked and rushed headlong away, while the gentlemen escorting them burst into Homeric laughter. So ended our visit to Semyon Yakovlevitch. At this point, however, there took place, I am told, an extremely enigmatic incident, and, I must own, it was chiefly on account of it that I have described this expedition so minutely. I am told that, when all flocked out, Liza, supported by Mavriky Nikolaevitch, was jostled against Nikolay Vsyevolodovitch in the crush in the doorway. I must mention that since that Sunday morning when she fainted, they had not approached each other nor exchanged a word, though they had met more than once. I saw them brought together in the doorway. I fancied they both stood still for an instant and looked, as it were, strangely at one another, but I may not have seen rightly in the crowd. It is asserted, on the contrary, and quite seriously, that Liza, glancing at Nikolay Vsyevolodovitch, quickly raised her hand to the level of his face and would certainly have struck him if he had not drawn back in time. Perhaps she was displeased with the expression of his face or the way he smiled, particularly just after such an episode with Mavriky Nikolaevitch. I must admit I saw nothing myself, but all the others declared they had, though they certainly could not all have seen it in such a crush, though perhaps some may have. But I did not believe it at the time. I remember, however, that Nikolay Vsyevolodovitch was rather pale all the way home. End of Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 2. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.